Hey, good afternoon. I'm Rick Hess, Director of Education Policy Studies at the American Enterprise Institute. Delighted to have all of you with us this afternoon for a remarkably timely conversation, restoring free inquiry and civility in higher education. I'm honored to be joined by three guests who have enormous experience wrestling with some of the thorniest issues we're dealing with in American higher education. Raj Vinnakota, president of the Institute for Citizens and Scholars, John Alger, the longtime president of James Madison University in Virginia, and Lori White, president of DePauw University in Indiana. Hey, thank you all so much for making the time to be with us today.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Happy to be here.
So just to level set for the audience, I think most of the folks who are watching something like this may be aware that the questions of free inquiry and free expression in higher education and civility on campus have been hot ones for a while now. The annual FIRE survey suggests that huge numbers of students say they don't feel able to speak honestly in classrooms on many campuses, that they feel that they need to censor themselves when engaging with fellow students. We have heard faculty from across the country express concerns about restrictions on scholarship, and we have heard those concerns coming for a long time from more conservative scholars. And just yesterday, the American Association of University Professors issued a burning hot report attacking the state of these issues in Florida. So we've got a lot of concerns about whether campuses are places where we can have free inquiry and honest conversation. Also, more recently, especially since the Hamas attack on Israel in early October, we have seen a lot of concern about civility on campus. We have seen social media of students being bullied, Jewish students being harassed, seemingly with impunity. This all led to a high-profile hearing in U.S. House of Representatives earlier this week, when presidents of three of the nation's most famous institutions of higher learning, Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania, testified for 5 hours about how they're dealing with anti-Semitism on campus. I'd say there has been extraordinary conversation out of that hearing. And one of the things that has been most prominent is a sense of double standards on many campuses. The campuses have been engaged in stifling or restricting uncomfortable speech when it comported with the broader philosophical orientation of higher ed faculty. But in the last 6 weeks, they have suddenly discovered the virtues of untrammeled free speech when it has come to chants of, when it has come to language that is frequently interpreted as crudely anti-Semitic. So let's talk about all of this. I don't want to put you in a position to, do a studio analysis of what happened in the House of Representatives this week or that. But I do want to ask all of you, what is the state of free inquiry and civility on campus? How fair are some of the criticisms and concerns? And let's start with that. Raj, you want to get things started?
And Rick, thanks for having this very timely conversation. So I would say that kind of as the Institute for Citizens and Scholars who's working with a number of institutions, but let's even pare back and just look at the macro issues. We're really struggling with two sets of complicated issues. One is trying to figure out where's that line between free expression and intimidation, harassment, and potential violence, right? How do we figure that out? And it might look different on different campuses, but trying to figure out that line has been something that's been very difficult. And then secondly, what is the consistent application and modeling of what debate and dialogue that's constructive actually look like on campuses? And how do we ensure that that's done well? And you develop the skills in all members of those communities to be able to do that effectively. And both of those we're finding to be really challenging in this moment. And yesterday was one example of that.
And Raj, so the Institute for Citizens and Scholars has launched a call for campus action. If I have is that the label right?
It's call for free expression.
Call for free expression. And you've got 14 college university presidents involved. Laurie and John are two of them. And I want to talk a little bit further along about what that involves and how you are doing that. But Laurie and John, obviously, this is something that I know you all, as part of that community of leaders, have been wrestling with for the better part of a couple of years. How are you thinking about what we're seeing, and how do we start understanding the challenges?
Well, Rick, let's start by being clear that anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, harassment against an individual because of the identities that they hold has no place on our college campuses. We all agree with those values. And I'd like to start, in response to your question, by talking about how I have come to view the critical issues of freedom of expression on our campuses, and why I am so excited to be a part of Citizens and Scholars and working with Raj and John and other college presidents. So just real quickly, I grew up in San Francisco, California, in a wonderfully diverse, multi-religious, multiracial, multi-ethnic neighborhood. I thought the whole world was like my neighborhood in San Francisco until I went away to college and I realized that it was not. And, sadly, we are living in a society that is resegregated by race, by ethnicity, by economics, by religion. And, one of the first places that our students encounter difference is on our college campuses. And so there's no wonder there are some challenges there. And we can come back to that point that I just made. Secondly, I went to UC Berkeley as an undergraduate on the tail end of the free speech movement. And of course, they say, those who remember the free speech movement weren't really there, but I was there a little bit after. And so I do remember. But what I most remember are the principles of free speech. And if we think about what was happening in the 1960s, it was really about stifling the speech of young people, of college students who wanted to advocate against the Vietnam War, who wanted to advocate for the civil rights movement, and administrators trying to find out ways to squash the free speech of students. The third is that as I have worked in higher education, this is now my 42nd year. One of the things that I have observed, and you mentioned this, Rick, in your introduction, is that we are not giving students the tools to be able to engage in rich debate and discussion. And if we can't figure out a strategy to be able to help students develop the tools to be able to engage in this type of dialogue that they don't see many adults role modeling for them, then, what are the principles of higher education? And so I will stop there. And I'm sure my colleague, John, wants to jump in.
Thanks, Laurie. And let me agree as a starting point with what Laurie has just stated. And that is, there are a couple of values that are fundamental in higher education that are at stake here. One is the importance of freedom of speech as an absolute starting point, right? Freedom of speech and academic freedom undergird our educational mission. So they're absolutely essential values in American higher education. I'm at the university named for the father of the Constitution, and that means something to us in terms of our DNA. And we talk about this a lot with students. The other value, though, is freedom from discrimination and harassment, right? And how do you balance those things? So Laurie, you shared some of your biography. My friends like to say I'm a recovering lawyer, but that is my training and background. And I've worked previously in my career at the American Association of University Professors, which of course cares deeply about academic freedom in higher education for faculty and for students, but also in the U.S. Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which applies the discrimination statutes that apply in higher education. So it's been an interesting career to sort of think about those strands and how they come together and how you draw those lines. And a couple quick thoughts. One is that everybody favors free speech as long as they agree with it, right? But the real challenging tests come when you get close to these lines, when it's controversial and hard. And secondly, I think it's important for us to remember that in higher education, we should expect that there are going to be controversies and controversial speech. Our mission is messy. The educational mission, by definition, is bringing diverse people, diverse perspectives together to be shared, debated, discussed. And the question is, how do you help students develop those civic muscles to do this well in community with each other, to create a learning environment in which everybody can participate and be heard? So that's the big challenge, I think, that we face as educators. And Rick, to your point about the challenges we face on campus, we did our own campus survey a few years ago, and we got the same results that you'd heard, where a lot of the students said they were afraid to speak up at times, and it wasn't because of their faculty. It was actually because they were afraid of offending fellow students. It was sort of like the Thanksgiving table discussion, right? Don't bring up politics or religion with your relatives. And so that was something we really took to heart. And part of the reason that we joined the campus call with Raj and Lori and others was we thought, we really need to work on these civic muscles with our students to help them to understand, look, we want you to be able to debate and disagree and hear controversial and different points of view you might not agree with, but also to learn from and with each other. So how do you do that? That's the hard work that we've been engaged with and working with Raj and others on that.
So, this crucial tension that you all have alluded to in different ways between making sure higher ed is a place where we're exploring ideas and having crucial debates, and at the same time respecting the members of that community and ensuring that it's welcoming to everybody, regardless of identity. I think one of the things that has been so prominent in the conversation this week is the sense, and I'd be interested in how you think about this, and is this a fair concern or not, the sense that there's a double standard and how many colleges have addressed this, that they have, say, in the aftermath of the killing of George Floyd in spring 2020, or when it has come to issues like race-based admissions or abortion, campuses have both been very clear that the leadership thinks one side is right and has frequently seemed to use civility as a rationale for silencing or stymieing voices who disagree. And it feels like in this most recent set of developments following Hamas's attack on Israel, that suddenly campuses are saying, no, we can't possibly constrain or take a stance. We need to let rallies play out, even if they feature things that feel threatening or intimidating, or involve actual social media accounts of students being physically bullied. Are those concerns about a double standard? Do they have any? Is there anything reasonable about them in your mind, or are these kind of political attacks on higher ed?
Well, the way in which I'd like to respond, Rick, is that our principles of freedom of expression say two really important things at DePauw. They reinforce what John talked about, that as a liberal arts institution, we are about the free exchange of ideas, and that we want the members of our community to discuss, to debate, to refute, to research, to engage in the conversation about ideas. That's part of our obligation to graduate, as we say at DePauw, leaders that the world needs. And our principles of freedom of expression also rest on the fact that all members of our community need to feel affirmed, supported, that they belong to the institution. And when I talked about the fact that I grew up in this wonderfully multicultural environment in San Francisco, the reason that I made that point is because in my great multicultural friendship network, we don't always agree on things. And in fact, we're richer because we don't. But when we disagree, they are not personal attacks. And so if you create a campus environment where all members of our campus community feel supported, welcomed, and affirmed, then we can have these difficult conversations that don't devolve into personal attacks. And in fact, my campus, knock on wood, our students have been leading the way, going to an interfaith dinner tonight, hosted by our Muslim and our Jewish students. And I think it's because we have this commitment to these principles of community that allow these rich discussions on my campus to occur.
Rick, a couple of additional thoughts on that. I do think that we are a microcosm of society in many ways on our campuses, and there are a lot of cross pressures that you see played out on college campuses. For example, we've had polls that show that many students think it's okay to cancel the speech of others with whom they disagree. And we also see a sort of consumer mentality that I've run into with students where, this idea that the customer is always right. In other words, students that say, I'm coming here and I expect my beliefs and my opinions to be reinforced. I actually had a student a couple of years ago say to me that they didn't want to get messages or have to read things that they disagreed with on particular topics. And I said, my goodness, if you're not having that experience at JMU, you should ask for your money back, right? Because that's what should be happening in higher education. So to your point about double standards, when I was at the Office for Civil Rights, one of the tests that we used in these hard cases to determine where is that line between protected speech versus something that becomes the conduct that constitutes harassment or discrimination is that we would flip the script and we would say, okay, here's the speech or conduct that's at issue, and it might be directed at this particular group. Let's flip the script and imagine it a very different group, right, that you might consider, say, at the opposite end of the political spectrum or something like that. What finding would you make there? And that was an exercise that we did regularly. And I think it is hard, to your point, because our society has become so polarized now that we tend to sort of demonize and vilify people with whom we disagree, rather than understanding that, in higher education, this marketplace of ideas is what we should be having. And it is not a bad thing. James Madison wrote about this, right? That there are going to be factions in society with different points of view. So the key is, how do you, again, I call them civic muscles, but how do you help students figure out how to engage constructively in civil discourse? And these are skills that can actually be taught and learned. And that's what our job is.
Yeah, Madison, the kinds of folks who are watching this know that Madison wrote Federalist 10, which,
Exactly.
More than 2 centuries on is one of the most profound, inquiries into how do we deal with this. Raj, I'm curious. I mean, you've spent, the last few years trying to support and work with, more than a dozen college leaders. This double standard question, I know it comes up. How is it a reasonable concern? Is it an unfair slight of higher ed? How do you think about it?
So I think about it in a number of ways. First is that, to paraphrase what John said, it's messy work, right? We got to remember that what we're doing is we're dealing with all kinds of humans who are trying to work through these issues. Students on campus, many of them 18 to 22-year-olds, who are still kind of testing boundaries. And, I thank God that I didn't have social media when I went to college, right? And so on and so forth. So the testing of boundaries, the pushing, pulling, and so on and so forth, that's what happens at colleges, right? And so on. And you then use those moments to test how do you stay true to your principles and these challenges. So it's messy, and you're going to have times where things go a little off kilter or over the line. You got to figure out how to bring it back, right? All of that, that happens. Right. And for me, part of the reason why I got so excited both about the overarching work around civic preparedness, the College President for Civic Preparedness, and this campus call for free expression was noticing that there actually are many institutions that are walking the walk and trying to do this work well. And so the campus call for free expression was to try to actually get people to raise their hands and say, we're all working through this. We're not going to get it right every time, right? But we're actually doing the work. Come watch us, come learn from us, come teach us how to do this. And I would say, Rick, I mean, one of the things that to me has been incredibly exciting is that we started with 15 institutions when we came out publicly in August. We're about to double in size, right? In just a few months. And that most of that happened even before October 7th. There's even more incoming of people who are like, we want to engage on this work. We want to do it right. And we want to try to figure out how this messy work happens. So yes, you're seeing examples of that, but what we're also seeing is tons of examples of presidents and institutions who want to get into this messy work. That's why they got into work in the first place.
Okay, so let's talk about this a little bit. So I think one of the many sources of frustration is that nobody seems to be offering a constructive way forward. One of the criticisms that I've heard a dozen times since the House hearing on Tuesday was what either seemed to be disdain for the questions from members of Congress, or a sense that we're already doing the best we can. And I think a lot of us are saying, well, if that's the best we can do, we got a real problem. So when you talk about this campus call for free expression and the 15 plus university leaders who are working on it, what does it entail? What is the call for? And how is this going to work?
Rick, great question. And I can try to be as succinct as possible. This work actually started with a broader motivation. When we started having conversation 3 years ago, is because I was seeing in my conversations with very different college presidents from a wide array of institutions, as well as ideological perspectives and lived experience, a recognition of two things. One is that, frankly, that higher ed had lost its way in terms of centering civic preparedness, citizen development as part of its core mission. And we needed to do that again. Related to that was this notion that the pendulum was swinging too far in terms of higher ed being seen purely as a private good, right? I go to college, I pay tuition, I get a degree, that degree confers certain skills to be able to get a job. Very important. But higher education and colleges and universities also have a public good responsibility. And a significant portion of that is how do we go about developing citizens and to be able to function effectively and be kind of engaged in our society. And so we needed the pendulum to swing back. The second notion that we started to see was that presidents, frankly, were in almost untenable positions in trying to take this issue on. The incoming from students, faculty, administration, boards, donors, policymakers, right? Like, it was just so difficult that it was very hard to move forward, and that there would be strength in numbers. And so that is what led us to start what was initially the College Presidents for Civic Preparedness. When we decided that it was time to go public in January of this year and focused on 2 or 3 major projects, the first one that we said we wanted to take on publicly was this campus call for free expression, saying, hey, look, we're all going and recognizing, and you can go to our website and see the principles of free expression that these university presidents have coalesced around. And we want to do it together. We want to be able to demonstrate examples for others, ask others to join us in this journey, and also recognize that this is difficult, right? And that there will be strength in numbers and learning from each other and moving forward in a path that we could point to others to also join. So that was the whole motivation. And we're very lucky to have people like John and Laura to be part of this work.
So, John, Laura, you want to talk a little bit about what this means when rubber hits road on your campus? Because, right, I mean, we've all heard people say this stuff plenty of times. So
Right,
what are
that's
you
right.
guys doing to put some teeth in this?
Yeah, so Rick, maybe a couple of thoughts at James Madison University, for example. First, to Raj's point, one of the things I think that we've learned is that civics education needs a renaissance in this country, right? That when you think about who comes to us, they're coming out of K-12 education, and it's not getting the same level of attention as, say, science and math. Now, don't get me wrong, science and math are really important, but we also need to focus on civics education. So at JMU, for example, as part of our general education program, we have a requirement called the American Experience, and it focuses on understanding America's government, political institutions, and these values like freedom of speech and where they come from, because we actually can't assume that students have grown up valuing those. You know, there are polls that show a large number of students that even think that democracy isn't necessarily the most important thing, right? So there's a lot of work that we have to do to level set with our students. At JMU, when we talked about what could we do in terms of providing something for all of our students, not just for some, because I was a political science major and I had lots of classes that had debate and that sort of thing. But what are you doing for students in the sciences and across the curriculum? The first thing that we've done as part of Campus Call was we had a session during orientation for all of our incoming students and transfer students to talk about the importance of free expression. And it was interactive, where students could respond to questions, and in real time they would see what was the reaction, across the entire group of assembled students. Next year, we're going to try to raise that even higher and have student facilitated discussions, because we want students to be leading these conversations, develop that sense of agency and responsibility that comes with that. And then we have what we call sort of ambassadors, faculty fellows and student democracy fellows that work both with the curriculum and then also with student organizations and student activities to try to incorporate these values and these ideas across the curriculum. So just one example, in health, the health professions, we have a health policy summit where students come together and they debate important health policy issues of the day and try to come up with solutions on diverse teams to these problems and actually present them to legislators and other policymakers. And that's an example of trying to take these values outside of the typical suspects like political science or philosophy and history and incorporating them into other academic departments and units across the entire university. And so that's what we're trying to do, is to work with our faculty and students to build these civic muscles and to think about debating and discussing important public policy issues of our time that impact them no matter what their academic major might be.
Laurie,
Go ahead, Rick.
Oh, I just was going to say, you want to talk a little bit about what this looks like at DePauw?
Sure. And I was going to also say that this is one of the benefits of being a part of the Citizens and Scholars Presidential Group, is we learn so much from one another and are able to exchange ideas. And so some of the work that we have been doing at DePauw, some of it is similar to what John has described, and there's some things that we are doing that are also different. And so similar to John, we also had a module during orientation, which introduced students to the principles of freedom of expression. I think adults, when we talk about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, young people don't quite know what that means. And so starting to educate them as first-year students, what that means and what it means in the context of higher education. I also joined the call.
Is that sessions? Is that in classrooms? How do y'all do that?
Oh, so we do that as part of when students first arrive on campus. All of our students go through a series of orientation modules on any number of topics. And this is one of the topics in which we engage our students. I also joined the call to deliver my convocation address, talking about the values of freedom of expression and reminding students that, again, this is an important value at DePauw, an important part of what we believe is a liberal arts education. I also received some funding from the Lilly Endowment here in Indiana to bring together faculty and staff across the state so that we could talk about how could we work together on reinforcing the values of freedom of expression, not only here on my campus at DePauw, but across all of the colleges and universities in Indiana. And we are going to do the same thing with our students. So bringing students from across the state together to talk about the ways in which they can do what you described, John, which is to be freedom of expression and civic ambassadors when they go back to their campuses. And of course, participating in conversations like this so that we can continue to reinforce what an important value this is to graduating young people that we know are important to furthering our democracy.
Let me give you, to your earlier question, a couple of the ways in which very specifically strength in numbers actually helps you to be able to address some issues. So one is that the presidents of these institutions, in addition to doing campus call for free expression, also said that we need to bring faculty into this issue, right, to Laurie's earlier point. And so we ran a faculty institute this summer. We had more than 30 faculty members from 18 institutions on how to bring contentious issues into the classroom, right? How to develop those skills in our faculty so that they could then transfer those skills to students, right? It's a pilot. We're now having each of those faculty members incorporate those skills into their classes. One of the interesting things, to John's earlier point, is that it also was very different in terms of the disciplines. About 40% of them were social sciences, 40% humanities, and 20% STEM. So we had a really interesting group of faculty. It was a pilot, but we can do that because our presidents came together and said, let's all go in together, see what we can learn from trying this, and then, see where we can go with this in order to be able to develop the skills of our faculty. Similarly, the president's also said we need to be able to understand how we're capturing the effectiveness of this work. Where are we measuring this work? And are there ways in which we can create a community of practice to be able to measure this work together? And so we have a whole tranche of work that's around measurement on higher education campuses around these very issues. And that comes from being able to have the strength of numbers and multiple institutions working together.
Yeah. I might just add, Raj, I think we're talking about a couple of things here with certainly training faculty and empowering them to do this. I know in the classes that I've taught, I actually asked our Center for Faculty Innovation to help me practice what I preach. And so they came in and they taught our students the art of long debate, working in teams. And the students didn't get to pick which side of the debate they were on. And it turns out that that was really valuable in sort of depersonalizing debate and helping students to learn, how do I use facts and evidence and research to debate? The other thing, though, is empowering students themselves to lead these discussions, because a lot of this we've been talking about, that sort of peer pressure and students responding to other students. So last year, for example, we had 20 of these peer facilitated deliberative forums where students were trained to lead hard discussions aimed at bridging political and cultural divides. And as a result of that, it was very interesting. 90% of all students said that they found common ground across political differences. 95% said they could express their views, and 92% of self-identified conservative students felt that their views were listened to. So we do have some good models out there, and I think empowering students and giving them that sense of agency to help lead these discussions is really an important thing that we should be doing.
So let's unpack this a bit in terms of both students and faculty, because some of the stuff you guys are touching upon, it just seems crucial and also seems really hard. So, for instance, in the Surgeon General's report a couple of months back on loneliness, the Surgeon General noticed that Americans 15 to 24 spend 70% less time just interacting with people, with friends, than they did 20 years ago. They do 40 minutes a day of in-person interaction. And one of the consequences of that is you just get a lot less practice talking to people and hearing their views. And we spend a lot more time in social media, where people tend to be one-dimensional and where it is easy to say ridiculous things and get positive feedback for saying them. So when that's the water that your students are swimming in, and you've got to teach them the habits of mind and the mores of civic engagement, it seems that you really need to lean into this in terms of the amount of time, the amount of coaching. So what does that look like? How does that change the way I guess I'm skeptical that even faculty who knew how to do this could do it in their 3 hours a week in their seminar. It seems like it needs broader change, more purposeful changes. So curious how you guys are thinking about that.
Let's go first. Go ahead, Laura.
Go ahead, Raj.
So I'm going to say in a general way, and they can talk about it in the specific. This has to be an institutional priority, Rick, and it has to happen curricularly, co-curricularly. It has to happen in student life. The president and the administration has to decide that they want to make this an area of focus, because it does require investment of time and effort. And frankly, in order for any of it to be durable, it needs to become part of the culture. And I mean, you understand this, you write about this, right? Like, you actually need it to be practices, habits, norms. And trying to now do it at scale is what makes this so difficult. And I think one of the greatest values that we bring in running this program and having college presence is we can quickly learn from each other and frankly create the scale for the nonprofit providers that we need to be partnering with multiple institutions to actually implement this. It is hard.
And I also think it's hard, and Raj and John referred to messiness, and it takes time. This is not going to be an instant overnight fix. And so I think we have to be patient and stay the course. And I really appreciate John talking about areas on our campus that we can lean on, whether it's our Center for Teaching and Learning, whether we have the Prindle Institute for Ethics. There are faculty on our campus who this is their area of expertise. And as Raj says, this really has to be about the entire campus. I think we're starting in pockets. We're starting with some subset of our students. We're starting with some subset of our faculty. As they become converts, we will widen that circle. But Raj is right. This really has to be a 100% campus effort. We really have to be all in.
Yeah, and I would agree. I think that certainly the tone from the top matters. And so having presidents that are speaking about the importance of these issues all the time is really crucial for students and parents and others to hear that. The coordination is also important and valuable. So for us, it's our Madison Center for Civic Engagement that leads these efforts across the entire campus and provides tools and resources to faculty, to students, and student organizations. I think, one type of concrete example, the most undervalued leadership skill, I think, and civic skill is actually active listening. And one of the exercises we did in the class that I taught, we actually brought in communications faculty. And, to the point, Rick, that you made about, social media, and of course, COVID exacerbated the social isolation, right? Students didn't develop those skills of how you sit in the same room with someone else and look them in the eye and talk. Well, we practiced in my class this exercise where you were standing just a few inches away from someone else, no cell phones, you're looking each other eye to eye, and you had to practice for 2 or 3 minutes at a time, just listening, not responding, listening. And then you had to say back what you thought you had heard. And that was a really hard exercise. It turns out people should try it sometime because it's actually pretty rare in our society. So there are some skills that need to be taught and reinforced across the curriculum. And that's certainly something that we're trying to do. And I would say, again, that sometimes we don't give our students enough credit. I've actually seen our college Republicans and college Democrats work together in all sorts of ways. And that's something else that we encourage, is the more that some of these groups can come together, try to find common ground, sponsor some events together. Maybe it's a debate, but the students want a better way, and they're anxious to actually solve problems, but sometimes they just need good role models. And sometimes they need us to get out of their way and let them sort of work out some of this messiness together. And I think we're actually seeing some of that happening on a lot of our campuses now.
So
Rick,
how much does this implicate the way that faculty are currently trained and the way their jobs are currently organized? I mean, I as a one-time academic, I know, getting my PhD in political science at Harvard, there was never an hour's thought spent on how I would teach. That was, as a former high school teacher, I was always slightly struck by that, the complete disinterest. We know that there are centers on campuses, as you all have alluded to, that faculty can go to. But for most faculty at most of the kinds of institutions that you guys are leading, teaching itself is a distinctly secondary priority. That we've reduced time faculty are expected to spend teaching over the last 30 years, that they are rewarded and promoted and honored based typically on research or on serving on university committees. So is part of this that we need to recalibrate how we understand the role of faculty and how they interact with students? Or is that not part of the puzzle here? Curious how you're thinking about it.
Well, I would say, Rick, we are a teaching institution first as a small liberal arts college. So I got my PhD from a research institution. So I understand what you're saying. A faculty member would not earn tenure here at DePauw if they weren't a great teacher as well as involved in their scholarship. However, to your point, I think teaching is certainly different now in the current environment in which we are in. And our faculty, very much, as Jonathan said, leading from the top, need for presidents to affirm academic freedom and the right of a faculty member to pursue their particular research interests and to make sure that when they speak out, that we support their ability to speak freely in the same way that we would for our students, and that we also give our faculty the tools to be able to facilitate what are really challenging discussions in classrooms about challenging topics, such that faculty too aren't afraid that if they say something that they too are going to be end up in a social media web. And so they are also looking to presidents like Jonathan and myself to affirm the really important work that they do inside of and outside of the classroom.
Yeah, I would agree. We also are an institution that focuses very heavily on teaching. So like Lori, you wouldn't earn tenure at JMU unless this is something that you focus on. But having said that, Rick, you're absolutely right. It is something we have to pay attention to. You know, faculty have expertise in all these very specific disciplines, but that doesn't mean everybody is going to be the expert in pedagogy in terms of how do you incorporate, you know, healthy debate and discussion into the curriculum. So that's why we have some centralized resources. We have a new faculty orientation, for example, for all incoming faculty where we talk about these types of issues. A lot of schools like us have a Center for Teaching and Learning. Ours is called the Center for Faculty Innovation. And that very specifically is to provide tools and resources for faculty who want to do things like this, but maybe have never done it before. And of course, one of the great values of being a part of this campus call through the Institute for Citizens and Scholars is that we are sharing resources and syllabi and ideas with one another across institutions that we can share with our faculty. And so one of the things that's really helpful is when you start with a coalition of the willing, and you have people that can serve as those ambassadors to their colleagues to say, look, this is great, interesting work, and you'll find it enriching too. That really is helpful. So that's one of the things we have found to be really helpful at JMU is to start with some people that are the real shining stars, lift them up and have their colleagues say, yes, I can learn from them. And there are offices and resources to help me do so.
The other thing I would add is that it's also important on the resource end that we provide professional development funding for our faculty members as we ask them to perhaps utilize new muscles or teach new courses focused on civic engagement and freedom of expression. And so we certainly have invested in that way here at DePauw, sending one of our faculty members to the seminar this past summer, who now has asked to attend additional seminars so that she on our campus can be one of those ambassadors that you just described, John.
You know, in hearing you guys talk about this, John, you talking about the active listening component, for instance, of your class, or Laurie talking about making that part of the onboarding process for new students when they join you. It strikes me that, you know, part of this is exposure and mentoring and skill building that's not normally what we think of as part of a 13-week semester course at a college like JMU or DePauw. Does this suggest the need to think differently about some of the activities faculties are engaging in with students, the opportunities that are being constructed? How do you start to think through that on a campus, given kind of existing routines and rhythms?
I want to just jump in for a moment, Rick, because I think this question and the one before really gets at something that I'm wrestling with along with the college presidents, which is how does this look like at scale on a campus, right? And I think the answer is yes to faculty and student life and administration and coaches, right? Don't forget coaches and so on. And yes to pre-orientation, orientation, curricular, co-curricular, and so on and so forth. And it is literally, to me, both the most challenging and exciting part of the work that we're engaging in right now, which is we're all doing this, and it's a wonderful program to be working with all these presidents. We're all already doing this, but we're doing it with a percentage of our students. And now we want to be able to do it both more broadly and more deeply at each of the institutions. And so you're bringing up the right questions, right? It is exactly what we're wrestling with now. Don't necessarily have the answer, but I just want to affirm that because it is the issue.
No, I think that's a completely fair answer. And you know, I'm a big fan of lighting a candle, right? The first candle, it's good to get that thing lit and start figuring out. But you know, to bring this back a little bit, one of the things that, you know, we all come at this from where we sit. So I'm just going to come out where I sit. Is, you know, we had I raised this question of the perceived double standard before, for those of us on the right. It often feels like campuses are unfriendly, even hostile terrain. And one of the issues is it's no great secret that the American professoriate is much more progressive in general than it is conservative. And so when we're wrestling with these issues, so for instance, in the surveys on who students would silence, John's point about put yourself in the other shoes, the fire data, for instance, is that about 40% of students say they would ban from campus somebody who wanted to talk about gun rights, but it's only about 10% want to ban somebody who would speak about abortion rights. And so there seems to be an asymmetry. So as you're working with faculty, as you're hiring faculty, there's a lot of attention in higher ed to issues of inclusion and belonging and diversity and making sure that different voices and perspectives are represented. It doesn't feel like the same necessarily comes up on these ideological conversations, issues about how should we think about the role of family? How should we think of, and so as you're working with faculty and trying to think about how to make sure there's room for folks to feel included and heard in these debates, is it a challenge if the faculty tends to lean ideologically very strongly in one direction? Is that not a big challenge because this is about pedagogy and approach? Curious how you think about the challenge here.
Yeah. So Rick, a couple of thoughts I might start with. One is, I think you're absolutely right. We have to be very deliberate about making sure that we are modeling that marketplace of ideas that we talk about, right? Not just to hear from one side or to be an echo chamber. And so that's got to be a multifaceted approach. So a couple of examples of what we've tried to do at JMU. One is I sponsor something called the Madison Vision Series through my office, where we try to bring speakers from very different perspectives. And we've been very deliberate to have speakers across the political spectrum. Sometimes students have been, not happy about some of the speakers that have come in because they disagree strongly with what these speakers might stand for. But the point is the students find out that you can engage in civil discourse, that, the speakers always have to answer questions and interact with students and faculty. And sometimes we actually feature debates between people who come from very different points of view. And the students can see that, oh, you can actually have people that have very different perspectives and are friends, right? And that actually can seek common ground, even though they disagree strongly on important issues. So part of it is holding up those models very explicitly for students. The other thing is that you have to practice what you preach when it's hard. So I can tell you last year, for example, at JMU, we had some student organizations that brought in some anti-trans, to characterize it loosely, but some speakers, that were on that side of the spectrum. And it was very difficult and even painful for a lot of students in our campus community. But we understood that if we're going to talk about protecting free speech and these values, to your point, and not have double standards, that we needed to make sure that we could demonstrate that, yes, you could have speakers come to campus that a lot of students might disagree with. They would be able to say their piece, and then other students could either protest or have, their own counter programming. Our police were prepared ahead of time to deal with it. It all went off, just fine. The students actually were quite mature about it. But that's what you have to do, I think, right? You've got to be able to demonstrate that when the going gets tough, that we are going to double down on these values and to really be thoughtful and intentional about that.
Jonathan, I agree with you. And if we say that we're committed to diversity, then that means we're committed to diversity writ large, including ideological diversity, viewpoint diversity, political diversity, etc. Just a couple of things I would add is I also think it's important for us to model that we can engage in those difficult conversations. And so about a year and a half ago, we invited a speaker to campus whose viewpoints were probably different than my own on some issues. And he and I shared the stage together and really had a great conversation and took questions from the audience. And so I think we also need to role model, as you said, that we can engage in these really difficult dialogues. And the last thing I would say, Rick, because I know that you want to jump back in terms of the ideological diversity of our faculty. I would love to inspire folks who identify as more conservative to accept what often is not a lucrative salary to be a faculty member.
It's, I mean, Raj, for instance, I'm just curious, this came up this week in the House. The president of Harvard University was asked, about the composition of Harvard's university faculty ideologically. And President K said she just didn't know. The Harvard Crimson does an annual survey of this, reports that 1% of Harvard arts and science faculty identify as conservative, 90%. It strikes me that we are very conscious in higher ed today about trying to understand representation so that we can think of. So it strikes me as a willful blind spot to, on something that cuts very much to the quick of how we talk about big, important issues. Shouldn't campuses be interested in trying to make sure that there's somebody on the sociology faculty who might come at it differently from the other 11 members of the social faculty? Is that part of this, or is that us right wingers kind of fishing for something?
So I think maybe simplistically, but I actually think and believe that if you actually endeavor and succeed in getting a culture of free expression and support faculty, that is actually a faster way of actually getting at this issue. That is, the faculty process, it well, right? That's generational. But how can we do this in a way where we're working with the faculty that we've got, right, who have gone through an incredible process of understanding their issues, rigor, and so on, and ensure that we now develop in them the skills and the support and the backing, right, knowing we've got their back, to actually be able to create environments to be able to allow for many different perspectives, right? If we do that, that's going to be a much faster way to be able to get at this issue, and to be able to truly say, we are creating places that are actually searching for truth and trying to civically prepare all our citizens to engage in that truth-seeking process.
So here's a really neat audience question that came in that when dealing with these challenges in terms of students, how do we think about if the reluctance to engage is temperamental rather than a lack of information? So what if it's that students just don't have, I guess, the skills or the inclination to engage? I'm curious how, as you guys are wrestling with this and with kind of the coaching and mentoring, how do we separate these two pieces of it?
I think part of the question that you're asking is, what's the preparation mechanisms before students show up on campus, right? And you and I could, of course, have a webinar twice this length on what's going on in the K-12 situation, right? So I would argue that, I'm not a college president, so I'll just say this. It's like they're getting what they're getting, right? And what they're getting is a student body that has been on social media, right? And understands social media, cyberbullying, and cancel culture very well, right? Unfortunately, for what it is and how it works, and hasn't really had as much practice on the habits and norms and muscle building around any of these issues. Right. So I just want to kind of lay that out, that yes, they're dealing with a population that's coming in with that hasn't had much practice kind of on day one. So they're playing catch up.
Yeah. And Raj, I think there are things that we can do. I think about some of the law school classes that I took where I had faculty I didn't know where they were on the ideological spectrum necessarily, because we were assigned readings that covered the gamut in terms of intellectual diversity. So there are faculty that teach that way. And, in education, we're talking about making points based on facts and evidence and research, right? That, you could be an astronomer, but if you say the moon is made of green cheese and you can't back that up with your research, you're probably not going to get tenure, right? So there's a difference between just unbridled free speech and academic freedom that furthers that educational mission. And so I think that's something that's important, is always returning to our mission and saying, what is it we're trying to do? One thing that I have found useful is getting students to play devil's advocate. And I mentioned, for example, in the team debates, when students didn't get to choose what side of a debate that they were going to be on, but they had to use facts and evidence and research to make the best arguments that they could. What it did is it sort of took them away from personalizing every argument, right? That they realized, look, I need to learn these skills, and it's not about my identity that's wrapped up in everything that I'm saying. So I think that there are some very specific things like that that you can practice. And certainly, maybe it's because I'm a lawyer and I had that kind of law school training, but some of my best friends and I would argue all the time, and friends would say, gosh, I hate you guys fight like that, because it made other people uncomfortable. And we'd say, fight? We're just having a discussion. You know, this is fun for us, right? And sometimes we would play devil's advocate just to make sure that we had covered all the bases.
Mm. You know, Lori, let me ask you, another version of this, I guess, that I think about is it seems to me we've got this weird dichotomy where we've got a lot of attention to making sure that there's free speech on campus in the sense that folks can protest and wave banners and be heard. But it often feels to me like that's pretty far removed from the educational mission. We're not necessarily listening or understanding. We're just chanting and yelling, whatever it is that we have. And in classrooms is where we find students reticent, that they're reluctant to speak up, they're nervous. It seems to me in some sense we got that backwards, that the educational mission of higher ed should really be we want students to speak freely and listen freely in classrooms. And I'd be okay if there was less marching and yelling left and right in the campus quad. Is that, I mean, but again, I'm looking at this from the outside, curious how you think about it from where you sit and how we get from here to there.
Yeah, wow, what an incredible observation. I had not thought about it that way. And so here's just a couple of quick responses. When you're chanting and protesting, you're largely in a crowd. And so there's some anonymity to that, not always, but there's some anonymity to that. And that also seems now to be the way that students think that you affect change, either, through a change.org petition, or sitting in the president's office, or, marching in the streets. That's what this generation believes that they need to do in order to affect change. Being in a classroom is a lot more personal. And as, my colleagues have said, what our students really are most afraid of, it isn't so much using their voice. It is, if I happen to get it wrong, or I'm on the wrong side of what I think my peers think, then I'm going to be forever socially ostracized. And so, it's a different experience than when all of us were in college, not trying to, out anybody in terms of age, but we probably weren't in college with social media. And so I think we have to be sensitive to the fact that our students are just afraid, not so much of us, but of their peers. And can we, again, going back to, can we work to create an environment where people feel supported and affirmed and safe by the way in which they define it, such that they feel like they can then jump in to this marketplace of ideas.
Yeah, Laura, I'm glad you mentioned, social media has come up several times, and I really do think that is one of the big challenges of our age. You think about this practice of doxing, where students try to shame a fellow student with whom they disagree, and that kind of thing is very real now. So something that happens in the classroom may not stay in the classroom. I don't know if we need to ban cell phones from classrooms. I'm not suggesting that. I know there might be people that would disagree, but there are some real challenges when it comes to this age of social media that, frankly, I'll speak for myself, I didn't have that in college. I wasn't worried that someone was secretly recording me or was going to send out a message to the world after class if they disagreed with what I said. So that is something I think we need to be talking about, and how to create some limitations. If we could pull the plug on social media periodically, I think we'd have some much healthier classroom conversations.
There's this compelling randomized control trial from intro economics at West Point from a couple of years ago. Was it West Point or Annapolis? I forget which.
But don't mix those two up.
But students who had laptops did significantly worse on the econ final than students who had to go through the semester with paper and pencil. I always think there's something revealing about that. Hey, we're about at the end of our time together. I do want to make sure I give each of you a chance just to share a closing thought. I guess particularly for folks who are frustrated by where they are and are looking, for something to embrace as a specific on how we start to move in the right direction. What's one thing you would suggest to them or point them towards? John, you want to start?
Sure. Well, I'd say, first of all, join us in Campus Call. It's a great community for presidents to share, for faculty and institutions to share promising practices and ideas with each other. That's what we need to be doing in higher education. We don't all have to reinvent the wheel. And so that's one of the reasons I think for many of us, we need to model that lifelong learning. And that's what we're doing by being part of an effort like this. We don't have all the answers, but we now have a mechanism where we can share ideas and best practices. And we're committed to continuing to stay in dialogue with each other going forward so that we can figure out how can we do this better. And having some coordination on campus, we have our Madison Center, Lori's got a center, but that really does help as a starting point to make sure that this is thought about on a continuing basis.
Lori.
I would just add that I would encourage people to commit themselves to these principles as fundamental to our democracy, and that asking each of us to start with ourselves to be role models for how we model respectful, engaging, difficult dialogues.
Raj, I'll give you the last word, my friend.
There are many, many college presidents from various varied backgrounds who want to do the right thing, who are engaged on this journey. I get to work with so many of them, and that's an honor. Join us in that journey because this is really fighting for our democracy.
Thanks to all of you. Appreciate you guys making the time today. It's been a pleasure, and look forward to talking to y'all soon. Thanks much. Good afternoon.
Thank you. And thanks everyone for joining us.
Great to be with you.